10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good evening from Singapore, and it's my privilege to be here to share with you some of the experiences and some of the thoughts that we have been trying to go through while coping with COVID-19 back here. Now, I begin with a few observations. Now, when last year, when the COVID-19 pandemic came about in Singapore and globally, we went viral on social media asking, and who led the digital transformation of your company? Is it your CEO? Is it your CTO? Or is it COVID-19? Well, the answer was obvious because in just a mere few weeks, the whole world, including seminaries and university, all stumbled into digital learning as a result of COVID-19 lockdowns. Now, this remains the case for many schools, including the Biblical Graduate School of Theology, BGSD, where I teach. Now, many of us are now examining the opportunities and roles that digital learning can now play in theological education. Now, this paradigm shift is also occurring within a broader context, ranging from the enrollment decline in Western seminaries, and yet at the same time the rise in demand in Asian seminaries, and also the rise of digital training alternatives and the disruptive challenges of the Industrial Revolution 4.0, and down also to the shift in global geopolitics. Now, so in this paper, I shall be surveying these changes before examining the merits of digital learning for training adults in seminaries, particularly for Singapore. And I shall also explore what this may mean for BGSD, which is an Asian theological school. Now, I begin with some emerging challenges and opportunities in Asia and Singapore. Now, with regards to digital education, digital distance education, it is now mostly mainstream in North American seminaries, but the adoption rate is far less in Asia. Now, this can be due to either the lack of resources and infrastructure within a country, or simply a preference for in-person teaching. Now, in Singapore, for example, BGSD is about the only school that adopted a blended learning approach to training our students prior to the pandemic. And in our case, it's due to the fact that we are largely a part-time school. All our students are working elsewhere. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, changed everything for us. So almost overnight, seminaries worldwide became online schools. And having discovered the benefits of online learning, many have continued to employ these training modes, even when the pandemic restrictions have eased. Now, this being said, the real long-term disruptors of theological seminaries are neither pandemics nor other seminaries. Now, I believe that they are actually alternative modes of training delivered through digital platforms, such as Faith Live TV or Seminary Now, which basically can deliver training anytime, anywhere at a fraction of the cost. Now, due to their investments in fixed assets and also faculty, it is difficult, I suspect, for traditional seminaries, brick-and-mortar seminaries, to match the disruptive prices of these new platforms. Now, these platforms, however, are only one facet, I think, of the broader impact that digital disruptions are making on theological education. Now, the advent of Industrial Revolution 4.0, IR4, is heralding what is called a rapid merging of the physical, digital, and biological worlds that will fundamentally change the way we work and live. Now, to help future generations flourish in this new environment, institutions of higher learning must now transform themselves into nimble institutes of lifelong learning that can help students pick up new competencies to retool themselves regularly. Now, the challenge for seminaries are similar and twofold. Firstly, how do we prepare Christians to engage the new ways of living and the ethical challenges that IR4 poses? Many of these topics are really addressed by the paper, so I wouldn't be touching on that. Now, the second is what I shall focus in, is basically how would the emerging educational technologies inform the way we educate and disciple Christians? Now, so this second question is our focus as we explore the merits of digital learning for seminaries. Now, up until the 2000s, discourse about digital learning has been the domain of educators. Now, as they see it, the impact of computing on classroom learning has largely been marginal. Now, Larry Cuban puts it this way: that computer meets the classroom, classroom wins. Now, this being said, educational technology did contribute to the progress of one sphere of higher education, which is distance education. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this has been employed extensively by many theological colleges in the West to train lay people and church leaders who simply don't have the time or means to set aside to basically engage in full-time training. Now, the last decade, however, has seen a new voice entering the fold, and these are basically the developers of new educational technologies or business models, from the Khan Academy and Alt School to massive open online courses, books, platforms such as edX and Coursera. Now, this make very varied claims, from how digital technology can enhance learning to even reinvent higher education itself. Now, on first glance, the new players often offer much promise for transforming the face of education. edX, for example, delivers more than 2,800 courses to 34 million students worldwide. Now, previously, such courses will only be available to the privileged few who can enroll themselves physically in the universities who are now partners of Coursera. Now, this being said, Neil Selwyn also observes that these newcomers actually have very little understanding of the nature of education itself. There is also significant conflict of interest between their commercial goals and those of public education. Nonetheless, Selwyn does believe that these technologies are here to stay, and we need to reflect seriously about how human teachers can partner them, and this involves identifying aspects of human teaching that are irreplaceable by machines. Now, besides these concerns, many theological educators also reject digital learning on theological grounds. As they see it, the fact that, I quote, Christ took on human flesh indicates that theological education too should take place in the flesh, in a face-to-face environment, end quote. Now, Jones and others have pointed out, however, that much of the Apostle Paul's teaching were actually conveyed through his epistles. So no doubt the apostle did not regard the written word as a primary medium of his apostleship. Nevertheless, like his Greco-Roman peers, he did assume that his letters can not only convey his teachings, but also mediate his social presence and authority to his readers. Now, theological education, however, is not just about helping students acquire cognitive content. It is also about discipleship and the formation of the students. And so for this reason, Jones and others have stressed the importance of recruiting online faculty who are both theologically competent and also have the maturity to become a model for and to mentor their students. So this is basically a whirlwind tour of survey, basically, of the thoughts on digital learning, particularly for theological education. Now, I turn now to BGSD, where I shall give an account of how we have incorporated some of these concerns as we introduce digital learning into our school. Now, BGSD was founded about 30 years ago, and our vision has always been to equip the whole people of God, both ministry workers and lay people. In fact, the majority, about 95% of our students, are not in ministry, but they are basically working in marketplace. And so as marketplace professionals, as dealing with marketplace professionals, our students have to study part-time in the evenings or during weekends. Because of that, also, we have provided self-paced learning courses through multimedia formats, first through the videos, to VCDs, DVDs, and now online. Now, both approaches provide flexibility for our students while maintaining a high degree of in-person contact for lecturers and students. Now, in 2013, we adopted the blended learning approach to introduce even more flexibility for our courses. So we provide lectures online for self-paced learning. By doing so, we not only reduce the number of in-person sessions needed to complete the course, but also devote more time to higher order learning activities during tutorials, such as case discussions, debates, or project presentations. Now, when COVID-19 struck, BGSD, like most seminaries, repivoted to Zoom-based online learning. Now, this continued for us due to the uncertainties that still prevail. The only exceptions that being that courses that will benefit better from an in-person learning, such as counseling or spiritual direction. Now, with global adoption of digital learning, there is now less resistance for Christians to learn digitally. For the school, we think that this presents three areas of development. Number one, we hope to extend our training ministries to the region through Zoom classes so that those who previously cannot attend our classes due to time and financial constraints can now do so. Number two, we need to help our students to adapt to the manifold social, political, cultural, and theological shifts mentioned earlier. So that, we basically need to introduce more interdisciplinary courses to focus on real-world problems, such as one that we introduced recently on Christians in the disruptive and digital world. And finally, we shall also explore the potential of working with collaborators, fellow seminaries, locally and regionally, on educational platforms as a means of extending our ministry to the less privileged in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Jodi, who has a response for you.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me and for inviting me to respond to this really great paper. And I really enjoyed reading it because it helps me reflect on our own practices, what we've experienced and encountered in COVID-19, and then move to digital online learning platforms. So to begin, I would like to commend you, Pak Wah, for taking up the topic of digital ministry formation. Although this paper guides us to reflection upon the disruption and then calming, if you will, at theological education in the context of your biblical graduate school of theology in Singapore, its overall assumptions, imaginative questions, and conclusions can easily be translated across the global field of theological education. And this paper is not only timely, but it also reignites the conversation of theological and religious education in the digital age. A conversation, sadly, that has not really been developed outside of the sharing of digital tools at conferences and workshops. And your paper's discussion of emerging challenges and opportunities in theological education, specifically to that of seminary education, you also do a really nice job in offering us important questions to consider in relation to the question of how did we get here? Sure, the pandemic has propelled theological religious education to the digital age, taking along traditional faculty with its tie to digital places they have long resisted, as you also note in your paper, but the digital age of theological religious education has been on the horizon for quite some time. And out of this conversation, you do another fine job in reminding us of the emerging need for digital norms in the seminary. And in my opinion, it is these needs that will continue us onward into the new era of digital transformative teaching and learning. So they cannot be ignored any longer, but rather discussed extensively as we all work together to bring traditional forms of education in full view of digital possibilities and vice versa. Lastly, before offering my recommendations, I also like to commend you on the 3 areas of development that you highlight to be in play, for lack of better words, at BGST. And just to recap, that's reimagining our program, reaching a global audience. You're helping students make sense of the world around them. This is a point I really emphasize in my own, I guess, educational approach, is that we need to have to form laity and making sense of culture and political. Sociology is our friend. And using digital platforms to connect laity to professors and lay formation leaders that look like them, that speak their language, that come from those own cultures. And this is a very deep desire among that ministerial student. All these developments nicely highlight your sense of understanding of what it means to be and pursue digital theological religious education. And it is evident that you have critically reflected out of your own experiences as a student and a teacher informing these developments, as they are not only practical, but they communicate a theology of understanding of the other. So now I'm going to offer my recommendations, and these are the points I would recommend you revisit or explore more as you bring this early work and working paper into full life. The first point I'd like to highlight is what seminary? It's a question I pose. And your discourse, although you draw an adequate and accurate image of what is happening in seminaries, as far as for shifting to digital models, you do too broadly, in my opinion. For example, and you do highlight well a lot of the questions in American seminaries, but if I'm speaking out of Catholicism, because this does not speak at all to the Catholic experience seminaries of what's happening, although it is changing, because Dunwoody in New York City recently has gone online, and that was a huge shift for them. We're not the same as these other seminaries. So you do broadly, this broad stroke. And at the seminaries here in the US, specifically to Catholic, Eucharistic theology, Christology, and theological understanding of community is what drives them. So there's more of a resistance to online learning. And so it's really good for you to distinguish the specific denominations or religions to which you speak to, as it would offer better clarity to the context out of which you're speaking. That's my first recommendation. And my second recommendation, this is sort of, it flows into the rest, is your focus in on adult learning. You highlight the work of Malcolm Knowles and his angelological understanding that adults are self-directed, but there's so much more to adult learning than just this. And so my recommendation then is that you explore modern scholar Jack Mesereau and his outlining of transformative learning. In fact, I see Mesereau's variations of transformative learning as offering your use of disruption, which I absolutely loved your use of disruption, and organizational piece. And as far as he too sees transformation in the educational setting to begin as, in Mesereau's terms, disoriented dilemma. It's disrupted, and then we make sense of the disrupted, and it moves us to some form of action, and we're never the same again. And I think there's something there in this. So in outlining this process, I actually see at the beginning of your paper, I think this would provide a united thread to your own critical reflection of what you're witnessing and your institution in the global field. I really think there's something there you can play with. Other two scholars that I would like for you to sort of just visit, because I think it help with your thinking of adult learning, is Pablo Freire and his work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and his ideas on education as a process of freeing the oppressed. And the statement may get me in trouble in Catholic circles, but is there something in traditional seminary education that needs freeing? Traditions that hold laity or seminarians back from not only embracing digital forms of formation or education, but also using them in their own context and ministry. Is there something that we need to free ourselves because we're oppressing ourselves from engaging in the digital world? And I think Freire has some language there that would be fun to play with in that regard. I also would recommend you look at Jane Reagan's. She's from Boston College, and she wrote an excellent catechetical work called, it's a classic, Toward an Adult Church. And she grounds the scholarship of Mesereau and Freire in conversation with each other within a catechetical context. And I think this would help you better grasp how transformative learning is active in digital formation and adult learning. And this could also help you think of the where it's, she used a lot of narrative storytelling in that work, and you can actually help make you sense of your own institution and finding that existence with your own program. And lastly, the thing that really struck me the most and sort of like irritated me was Moody's vision. And so and I'm not familiar with Moody, so you can, school me on him. But Moody, as you quote him, he says, a vision for distance education to train lay people and church leaders who have not the time or means to take college seminary. Like it's almost as he's saying that for people who don't have the time to really engage in hardcore learning, we just jump over to digital. And I push back against this statement. And because distance education cannot be reduced in this way. It is not a quicker or easier way to get through deep theological discourse, but rather if done correctly and with a keen eye to justly offering all an opportunity to study the rich traditions of our faith in the same way in-person learning do, digital formation education, even our non-degree programs and certificate programs that tend to be like easier, if you were to put in those terms, requires more time actually from participant to participate in. It's in digital spheres that we almost work really hard to establish communities of presence. And that's a big term right now in the Catholic Church. Tim O'Malley wrote a Eucharistic theology book recently called Presence, a Eucharistic Presence. And I know Catherine in her book, A Virtual Communion, has hit upon this too, is that it takes a lot of time and effort because when you're working in those digital spaces, you have to check in on each other, you have to speak, you have to discuss, you have to attentively listen on Zoom sessions when you're at home in the midst of a chaotic family life, right? You have to be really attentive. And it's a lot of work to do that. And so it's important that you go back and clarify Moody's statement. And because I feel like he's I think this statement, as a way it's stated here, is dismissive of digital learning. And so I would go back and clarify that and play with it a little bit more. And I offer this a question to you and the rest, maybe for our discussion, is in your opinion, is what was Moody getting at anyway? So thank you for that.